A packed flight from Chicago to Seattle starts like any other until a woman's shrill voice shatters the calm. She zeroes in on a quiet passenger, her racist tirade turning heads. "You don't belong here." He's unfazed, but the cabin erupts. Tension skyrockets, whispers spread. Who is he? Why is she so sure he's trouble? The crew scrambles, passengers brace for chaos, and her smug demands push the edge. Then, the plane lands and one jaw-dropping twist flips everything. What's his secret? How does she crumble? Watch to the end. This clash of prejudice and truth will leave you speechless. Before we jump into this wild story, drop a comment below. Tell me which city you're watching from. I'm dying to know how far this tale has traveled. And hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on more gripping stories like this one. Whether you're in New York, LA, or halfway across the globe, let's connect, share the ride, and get started. Ready? Here we go. The flight from Chicago to Seattle was packed, and for James Carter, it was shaping up to be a typical day. He slipped into his seat, earbuds in, jazz humming as the plane rolled down the runway. No suit today, just jeans and a hoodie, perfect for blending in. As an undercover FBI agent, he knew how to disappear into a crowd. He was headed to Seattle for a routine briefing. Nothing special after years of tough cases. James popped in his earbuds deeper, hoping to tune out the world. It was March 6, 2025, and all he wanted was a quiet trip. As the plane lifted off from Chicago, climbing towards Seattle, James Carter let his gaze drift over the cabin. It was a lively mix. Families juggling kids and snacks, business folks tapping away on laptops, tourists flipping through glossy magazines about the Pacific Northwest. Up in first class, though, one passenger stood out for all the wrong reasons. Lydia Harper had been grumbling since they boarded, her voice cutting through the hum of engines like a blade. She was decked out in a sharp designer coat, gold bracelets clinking as she waved her hands, her face twisted in a sneer James knew too well from years on the job. She was what folks might call one of those, the type who thought the world spun just for them. Right now she was laying into flight attendant Sarah Miller, her tone dripping with disdain. "This seat's practically a rock. Do you expect me to suffer for 5 hours?" Sarah, all forced smiles and tight nods, murmured something about checking for a spare cushion, but Lydia wasn't having it. "I paid good money for this, and I deserve better," she snapped, loud enough for half the plane to hear. The other attendant, Emily Torres, hovered nearby, exchanging hushed words with Sarah. "Probably about how to handle her," James sighed, shifting in his seat. He'd seen this play out before, on flights and in life. Someone like Lydia, always ready to make a scene. He figured he'd keep his distance, let her tire herself out. His plan was simple: stay quiet, maybe crack open that paperback later, and hope the next few hours slipped by without her turning the whole plane into her personal battleground. James Carter settled deeper into his seat as the plane leveled out, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to his thoughts. He'd pulled his hoodie up a bit, earbuds still pumping jazz, and fished out that worn paperback thriller from his pocket. A beat-up copy he'd snagged at a Chicago newsstand. This flight was just a breather, a chance to recharge before diving into the Seattle briefing. He'd handled everything from late-night stakeouts to tense standoffs with cartel runners. A few hours in the air should have been nothing. His plan was clear: keep his head down, flip through some pages, and let the miles pass quietly. Up front, though, Lydia Harper had other ideas. She was still at it, her voice rising over the cabin noise as she demanded a fluffier blanket from Sarah Miller. "This feels like sandpaper. Do you even wash these?" she barked, holding the offending fabric up like evidence. Sarah's smile was wearing thin, her "I'll see what I can do" sounding more like a plea for patience. Emily Torres lingered nearby, muttering something to Sarah about "that woman" as they swapped weary glances. James caught it all from his spot near the back, shaking his head with a quiet sigh. Every flight seemed to have a Lydia, someone determined to turn a simple trip into everybody's problem. He'd dealt with worse on the job, way worse, but that didn't mean he wanted to get tangled up in her mess. He turned a page, trying to focus on the story. Some detective chasing a lead through rainy streets, but Lydia's sharp tone kept slicing through. He told himself to let it go. This was supposed to be easy, just a ride to the next case. Hopefully she'd burn out soon. An hour into the flight, the plane cruised smoothly over the Midwest, the cabin settling into a dull hum of chatter and clinking trays. Sarah Miller and Emily Torres rolled the snack cart down the aisle, passing out pretzels and cans of soda with practiced smiles. James nibbled on his handful, flipping another page in his paperback, the jazz in his earbuds keeping him steady. Then Lydia Harper's voice pierced through again, sharp enough to make heads turn. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, holding up her soda can like it was a crime scene exhibit. "I asked for bottled water, not this sugary junk." Sarah, keeping her cool, apologized softly. "We ran out of water, ma'am. I can get you something else." Lydia wasn't buying it. "What kind of cheap operation is this? I paid for first class and I expect real service." Her rant carried across the rows, loud and grating, pulling eyes from screens and magazines. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, some smirking, others frowning, but no one said a word. James shook his head, a faint annoyance creeping in. He'd met plenty like her, always turning nothing into something. He'd seen it on the job, too. Entitled types who thought Volume 1 arguments. Sarah stood there, nodding through the tirade, her smile tight as Lydia muttered something sharp under her breath, making Emily flinch as she hovered nearby. James popped his earbuds back in, cranking the volume a notch. He wasn't about to let her ruin his flight. He'd dealt with bigger headaches. Suspects screaming in cuffs, deals going south fast. This was just noise, he told himself, sinking back into his seat, hoping she'd wear herself out before long. It didn't take long for the storm to shift. An hour into the flight, with the snack cart gone and the cabin humming quietly again, James Carter decided to stretch his legs. He stood by his seat, careful not to block the aisle, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness. Up in first class, Lydia Harper's eyes zeroed in on him like a hawk spotting prey. Her lips curled into a tight sneer as she sized him up. Hoodie, jeans, nothing flashy. And her voice cut through the air. "Excuse me," she barked, waving a hand heavy with gold rings. "You, back there, sit down, you're clogging up the place." James turned, caught off guard but steady, realizing she meant him. He wasn't even in the aisle, just standing by his row, but she was locked on him now. "I'm not in the way, ma'am," he said, keeping his tone even. "I'll sit in a sec." Her eyes flared, her face twisting like he'd insulted her. "Don't make me. I've been watching you since we took off, acting like this plane's yours to roam." The words hit sharp, and James felt a flicker of something, annoyance maybe, or the old sting of being singled out. He'd dealt with her type before, loud and pushy, always hunting for a fight. Passengers nearby glanced over, some curious, some uneasy, but no one jumped in. Sarah Miller and Emily Torres froze mid-tack up front, swapping quick looks. Should they step in? James didn't flinch, just met her glare with a calm stare of his own. He didn't want a scene, not here, but Lydia clearly wasn't letting this drop easy. Lydia Harper wasn't backing off. Her eyes narrowed to slits as she leaned forward in her first-class seat, voice rising like a siren. "This isn't your personal turf," she snapped at James Carter, still standing by his row. "People like you always think you can do whatever you want." That phrase, "people like you," hung heavy in the air, and James felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard it before, too many times, and he knew exactly what she meant. The cabin went quiet, a thick hush falling over the rows as passengers turned to watch. Some looked shocked, others uneasy, their eyes darting between Lydia and James. "Excuse me?" he said, voice steady but edged with tension now. He wasn't letting that slide. "You heard me!" she shot back, louder, drawing every gaze. "I don't know how someone like you even got on this plane, but you need to learn some respect. I paid for my seat and I won't have you ruining my trip." The words stung, sharp and personal, and James felt the old anger bubble up. He'd faced racists in dark alleys and polished boardrooms, but up here, trapped in a metal tube at 300 feet, it hit different. Passengers shifted, whispering softly, some clutching armrests, others staring wide-eyed. Sarah Miller and Emily Torres stood frozen up front, caught off guard, maybe hoping it'd fizzle out. James kept his cool, though. Years with the FBI had taught him control. "I'm just trying to fly like everyone else, ma'am," he said, firm but patient. Don't make this something it's not. Lydia's glare burned hotter, her lips twitching like she had more to unload. The air crackled, and James braced himself. She wasn't done yet. Lydia Harper wasn't letting up. "People like you always think you can play the victim," she sneered, her voice thick with contempt as she glared at James Carter from her first-class perch. "I've been watching you, acting like you're entitled to everything. I deserve respect here." The words dripped like acid, and the cabin felt smaller, every passenger caught in the crossfire. Some shifted uncomfortably, their seats creaking. Others whispered behind cupped hands, eyes flicking between the two. James felt the heat rise in his chest, that familiar burn of being judged for nothing but his skin. He'd heard it all before, on the streets, in the field, but it never stopped cutting. Still, he kept his face steady, knowing he carried more than just himself in this moment. "Excuse me," he said again, voice low but solid, the tension clear in his tightened grip on the seat back. Lydia's eyes flashed. "Don't act innocent. I paid good money for this seat, and I won't let you spoil it." The air grew heavy, her words sinking into the silence like stones. A woman near the aisle clutched her purse tighter. A guy in a baseball cap shook his head, muttering under his breath. Sarah Miller and Emily Torres lingered up front, swapping nervous glances. Should they step in? They didn't move, maybe hoping she'd run out of steam. James knew better than to snap back. He'd faced down worse than Lydia Harper and walked away. But this wasn't just about him, it was every time he'd been sized up and dismissed. "I'm not here to bother you, ma'am," he said, patient but firm, locking eyes with her. She smirked, like she'd won something. And the fight was far from over. Lydia Harper wasn't done tearing into him. "You probably don't even belong in this country," she spat, her voice slicing through the cabin like a whip. "I bet you're one of those freeloaders living off people like me who actually work for a living." The words landed hard, and James Carter felt the air thicken around him, his fists clenched under his hoodie sleeves, nails digging into his palms. But he forced a slow breath, years of FBI training kicking in. "If it were up to me, you wouldn't be on this plane at all," Lydia added, standing now, her gold bracelets jangling as she pointed at him. The cabin buzzed with unease. A gasp slipped from a woman 2 rows up, and a guy in a flannel shirt muttered, "Jesus," under his breath. Every eye locked on James, waiting for him to crack. He'd faced worse, way worse on the job. Armed suspects, screaming threats, bullets close enough to feel the heat. But this, up here, with nowhere to walk away, was its own kind of hell, personal, raw, and loud. Sarah Miller and Emily Torres scrambled toward her, Sarah's voice shaky. "Ma'am, please, calm down." But Lydia waved them off like flies. "Don't tell me what to do. I'm the one keeping this flight safe." James's pulse hammered, anger clawing up his throat, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't let her win, not like this. "I'm just flying, same as you," he said, voice steady as steel, though his hand shook slightly. The lie of it burned. She wasn't like him, never would be. Lydia's face twisted, her sneer growing uglier. The plane felt like a pressure cooker, and she was turning up the heat. Lydia Harper took it further, her voice booming now as she stood tall in first class. "Somebody needs to put you in your place," she barked, jabbing a finger at James Carter like a judge passing sentence. The cabin froze, the air so thick you could choke on it. James stood by his seat, feeling every pair of eyes drilling into him, some wide with shock, others narrowed in discomfort. His fists stayed tight, but he kept his face blank, years of training holding him steady. This wasn't a bust gone bad or a suspect mouthing off. This was personal, and it hurt deeper. Lydia's face was a mask of fury and entitlement, her gold jewelry glinting as she waved her arms. Passengers held their breath, waiting for the next move. A kid in a Seahawks cap peeked over his seat, eyes big, while an older woman clutched her armrest. Up front, Sarah Miller and Emily Torres hustled toward her, their faces tight with panic, but no one jumped in yet. Maybe they thought it'd burn out. Then Claire Evans, a young woman in a denim jacket near the galley, leaned toward Emily, her voice low but firm. "Are you going to do something about this? It's out of control." Emily nodded, flustered, and took a step closer to Lydia, hands up like she was calming a wild animal. "Ma'am, please sit down," she said, voice trembling slightly. James locked eyes with Lydia, his calm a wall she couldn't crack. He wanted to fire back, tell her exactly what he thought, but he knew better. Engaging would just feed her fire. The plane felt like a stage, and Lydia was playing to the crowd, oblivious to the tide turning against her. "I said sit down," Lydia Harper bellowed, her voice bouncing off the cabin walls like a thunderclap. She stood rigid in first class, pointing at James Carter with a trembling finger, her face flushed red with rage. "You're making everyone uncomfortable." James stayed put by his seat, his calm exterior masking the fire roaring inside. He'd been through worse, shootouts, ambushes, interrogations that left him bruised, but this public shredding, this naked hate gnawed at him in a way bullets never could. It wasn't new, just louder, uglier, trapped up here with no escape. Passengers gawked, some leaning forward, others sinking low in their seats, the tension choking the air. Claire Evans up front turned to Emily Torres again, her voice sharper now. "Seriously, do something, this is insane." Emily nodded, her face pale, and edged toward Lydia, hands raised. "Ma'am, please, take your seat," she said, trying to sound firm but faltering. Lydia spun on her, eyes blazing. "I don't need you telling me how to behave," she snapped, brushing Emily off. "Do your job and get this man off this plane." Emily froze, caught between fear and duty, her eyes darting to Sarah Miller for backup. Sarah hovered nearby, looking just as lost. Nobody wanted this to blow up bigger. James couldn't stay silent anymore. "Ma'am," he said, voice cool but cutting, "I haven't done a thing to you. Sit down and enjoy your flight." That only lit her fuse hotter. "Don't you tell me what to do," she screamed, her pitch breaking with fury. "You people are all the same, always acting like victims, always thinking you're owed something." The cabin went dead quiet. Every word a bomb, and James braced himself. She was digging in deep now. The cabin crackled with tension, Lydia Harper's screams still echoing when a new voice cut through. Mike Sullivan, a tall, broad-shouldered guy in a flannel shirt seated a row behind James Carter, stood up, his face set hard. "Lady, you need to calm down," he said, his tone firm and no nonsense, slicing into the chaos. "You're out of line." Lydia whipped around, her glare venomous as she locked onto him. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down," she snapped, her voice shrill. "I'm the one being harassed here. I paid for my seat. I deserve respect." Mike shook his head, unfazed, his hands resting loose at his sides. "You're not the one being harassed," he shot back, steady as a rock. "Look around. No one's on your side. You're making a fool of yourself." A ripple ran through the plane, nods from a couple in hoodies, a quiet "yeah" from a guy with earbuds dangling. James felt the shift, a tiny crack of relief breaking through the heat in his chest, but he kept quiet, watching it play out. He'd seen this before. Someone stepping up when the mess got too big to ignore. Lydia's face twisted, her gold bracelets clinking as she crossed her arms tight. "I'll have you all kicked off this plane," she shrieked, her cheeks flaming red. "You're just jealous because I'm not afraid to speak the truth." Mike raised an eyebrow, almost amused, and sat back down, done with her. Passengers murmured louder now, some shaking their heads, others whispering support for Mike's words. Lydia's grip was slipping, her rage turning desperate, but she wasn't backing off yet. James stayed still, his calm a shield. She was unraveling, and he wasn't about to give her more ammo. Lydia Harper's voice hit a fever pitch, her threats bouncing around the cabin like loose shrapnel. "You're all against me," she screeched, her face a blotchy red as she glared at Mike Sullivan and the murmuring passengers. James Carter stayed quiet, his hands resting on his seat back, feeling her unraveling like a frayed rope. She was losing it, and he wasn't about to fuel her fire. Then, a new voice rang out, calm but commanding, from the front. "Ma'am, you need to sit down, now." Captain Daniel Brooks stood just outside the cockpit, his pilot's cap squared, his eyes locked on Lydia. The whole plane snapped to attention, passengers straightened up, whispers died fast. Lydia spun toward him, mouth open to argue, but Brooks raised a hand, cutting her off cold. "This behavior won't fly on my plane," he said, his tone steady as steel. "Either sit down and stop this nonsense, or we'll turn around and land right back in Chicago." The words hit like a gavel, and for the first time Lydia faltered. Her eyes darted around, catching the hard stares from rows of passengers. Claire Evans frowning, Mike nodding faintly, even the kid in the Seahawks cap watching wide-eyed. She wasn't in charge anymore, and it showed. Her shoulders slumped, but the fury still simmered in her clenched fists. "This isn't over," she muttered, venom dripping as she sank into her seat, her glare slicing back to James. He didn't bite, just sat down slow, keeping his face blank. Sarah Miller and Emily Torres exhaled, stepping back as Brooks gave a curt nod and returned to the cockpit. The cabin buzzed faintly, tension easing, but James knew Lydia wasn't done. She'd just been caged, not tamed. The cabin settled into an uneasy hush after Captain Brooks laid down the law. Lydia Harper sat stiff in her first-class seat, arms crossed tight, her knuckles white against the armrests. James Carter could feel her eyes boring into him from up front, sharp as nails, even as he leaned back and stared out the window. Clouds drifted past in lazy swirls, a calm that didn't reach inside the plane. Passengers eased back into their routines. Some flipped open laptops, others sipped lukewarm soda, but the air still carried a weight, like everyone was waiting for the next spark. Lydia muttered now and then, too low to catch fully, but James picked up the venom in her tone. "Shouldn't be here," she hissed once, loud enough for the guy next to her to shift awkwardly. James let it roll off him, or tried to. Those words, "people like you," echoed in his head, a tired old song he'd heard since he was a kid. He'd faced it all, sideways looks on the street, cold shoulders in precincts, outright slurs on the job. This wasn't new, just louder, stuck up here with no way out. His fingers brushed the paperback in his pocket, but he didn't pull it out. Couldn't focus now. Sarah Miller and Emily Torres moved through the aisle again, offering drinks with tight smiles, their glances flicking his way, nervous or sorry, he couldn't tell. He didn't blame them. Situations like this were a mess for everyone. Lydia's glare kept coming, a silent promise of more trouble. But James wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He had a briefing to get to, a case to crack. She was just a bump on the road, loud, ugly, but nothing he couldn't handle. Lydia Harper couldn't stay quiet for long. After a few minutes of muttered jabs, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood again, her gold bracelets clanging as she leaned into the aisle. The cabin tensed up fast. Passengers groaned softly, some rolling their eyes, tired of her act. James Carter caught her glare zeroing in on him, her lips curling into that same ugly sneer. "Look at you," she spat, loud enough to turn heads. "Sitting there like you've done nothing wrong. I bet you think you're so innocent, don't you?" James kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, refusing to bite. Inside, the frustration was piling up. She was a broken record, and he was stuck listening. "You don't belong here," she pushed, stepping closer, her voice rising. "I know what people like you do. You make everyone feel unsafe." A few gasps slipped out nearby. A woman in a scarf flinched, a guy with a beard shook his head, but still no one jumped in. James finally spoke, voice smooth but firm. "I'm not the problem here, you are." Lydia's face twisted, her laugh bitter and sharp. "Me? You've got nerve. I'm the one you're threatening." "I haven't said a word to you," he cut back, calm as ever. Her eyes narrowed, venom pooling. "Oh, I know your type, always causing trouble." The murmurs grew. Some passengers traded looks, fed up. Sarah Miller stepped forward from the galley, her patience gone. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to sit down," she said, voice stern now, no more pleading. Lydia spun on her, snapping, "Don't you dare. I'm not sitting quiet while he's here." Sarah held her ground, eyes flashing. "Sit, or we'll handle this when we land." Lydia huffed, but the fight wasn't over. A shaky calm fell over the plane after Sarah Miller's warning, but Lydia Harper's bitterness hung like a fog. She sat rigid, muttering under her breath, her eyes still stabbing at James Carter from first class. He tried to tune her out, leaning back in his seat, the hum of the engines filling his ears. He'd dealt with her kind before, loud, stubborn, blind to their own noise, but it never got easier. Then a small voice broke through. Ethan Parker, a kid with messy hair and a Mariners shirt, peeked over the seat ahead. "Are you okay, mister?" he asked, his tone soft and curious. James managed a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine, buddy. Thanks for checking." Ethan grinned, but his mom, Jessica Parker, tugged him back quick, whispering something sharp in his ear. The boy nodded, sneaking one last look at James like he was piecing together a puzzle. That little gesture hit James square, innocence cutting through the muck. He thought back to his first days with the FBI, wide-eyed and ready to prove himself. He'd faced doubters at every turn, cops who smirked, brass who questioned his grit, all because of how he looked. He'd shut them up, case by case, climbing higher than they'd ever dreamed. Lydia had no clue who she was picking a fight with, and that steadied him. Her voice hissed again, low but clear. "Doesn't belong here." James let it slide off. He'd heard worse, survived worse. His mind drifted to the Seattle briefing, the real work waiting. This was just a sideshow, a loud distraction he'd outlast. Ethan's question lingered, though, a quiet boost in the storm, still brewing around him. The quiet didn't last. Lydia Harper unbuckled again, stomping toward the galley with a fury that shook the cabin awake. Passengers sighed, heads turning as she waved down Sarah Miller like she owned the plane. "This is unacceptable," she shouted, loud enough to rattle the overhead bins. "You're letting that man stay here when he's making everyone uncomfortable. Are you out of your mind? He's probably a criminal." Sarah, her face etched with exhaustion, took a breath. "Ma'am, please go back to your seat," she said, voice steady but worn. "We've asked you to calm down multiple times." Lydia's cheeks flushed a deep red. Her eyes wild, she looked like a suspect James had once grilled, cracking under pressure. "Calm down," she shrieked, voice climbing higher. "You expect me to sit there while that man's a threat?" James watched from his seat, silent, his gut twisting at her words. She wasn't stopping, and it was getting absurd. "I demand to see his ID," she declared, her tone a piercing screech now. "He probably shouldn't even be here. Do your job and check him." Sarah blinked, stunned, fumbling for a reply. "Ma'am, we can't ask for ID once passengers are on board. Everyone's cleared security." "That's not good enough," Lydia fired back, leaning in close. "What if he's dangerous? He could be a hijacker for all you know." Jamie's hands tightened on his armrests, but he kept his face blank. Losing it now wouldn't help. Passengers nearby gaped, some horrified, others just done with her. He'd dealt with wild accusations before, but this was next-level nonsense. Sarah stood there, mouth half open, as Lydia's rant spiraled. Crazy, loud, and showing no signs of slowing down. Lydia Harper's rant was still ringing when Mike Sullivan stood up again, his broad frame filling the aisle behind James Carter. "Lady, you need to stop," he said, voice calm but sharp, cutting through her noise. "You're the only one causing a problem here." Lydia whirled on him, her face a snarl. "And who do you think you are?" she hissed. "You don't know what's going on. You should thank me for keeping us safe." Mike raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You're not keeping anyone safe, just making it worse." A few passengers nodded. Claire Evans up front, a guy in a trucker hat, murmurs of agreement spreading. James watched, still silent, feeling the shift. Lydia's grip was crumbling. She snapped back. "Oh, now you're all against me. I'm the only one brave enough to say it." Her voice cracked, desperation seeping in. Sarah Miller had had enough. She stepped forward, her tone harder now. "Ma'am, this is your last warning," she said, eyes locked on Lydia. "Return to your seat, or we'll have to make an emergency stop and get you off." Lydia's eyes bulged, her mouth twitching like she couldn't believe it. "You'd throw me off, not him?" she sputtered, jabbing a finger toward James. "He hasn't done anything," Sarah replied, firm and done. "You're the one stirring trouble." For a second, Lydia wavered, glancing around at the sea of fed-up faces. Then she huffed, stomping back to her seat, her glare burning into James one last time. "You're all clueless," she muttered, loud enough to hear. The cabin sighed as Captain Brooks's voice crackled overhead. "We're starting our descent into Seattle." She was down but not out yet. The plane tilted gently as Captain Brooks guided it into descent, the Seattle skyline creeping closer below. Passengers adjusted their seats, stowing trays, the cabin buzzing with the shuffle of landing prep. Then Lydia Harper unbuckled her seatbelt, the click loud against the hum, and stood up, ignoring the glowing seatbelt sign overhead. Heads turned fast, a ripple of groans spreading as she reached for her overhead bin. "I'm getting my bag," she snapped, her voice cutting through like a blade. Emily Torres darted down the aisle, her face tight with urgency. "Ma'am, you need to sit down," she said, firm but clipped. "We're landing soon." Lydia didn't even glance her way. "Do you know who I am?" she barked, yanking her designer purse free. "I don't need to listen to you." The cabin bristled. Claire Evans rolled her eyes. Mike Sullivan muttered something sharp under his breath. James Carter watched from his seat, his hands steady on his armrests, though his pulse ticked up. She was at it again, rules be damned, and it was wearing thin. Emily didn't back off. "Ma'am, sit down now," she repeated, louder, her tone leaving no wiggle room. Lydia's eyes flared, her face a mask of indignation. "Go ahead, call whoever you want," she sneered, crossing her arms. "I'm not the one you should worry about. Ask him what he's hiding." She jerked her head toward James, her glare venomous. The air spiked with tension, passengers trading looks, some annoyed, others uneasy, as her words stirred the pot again. James kept his cool, face blank, though the heat inside was building. Emily's jaw tightened, her hand hovering near her radio. "Sit, or you're out when we land," she warned. Lydia huffed, defiant still, teetering on the edge. The plane dipped lower, engines whining as it neared Seattle, and the cabin braced for touchdown. Lydia Harper stood defiant a moment longer, her designer purse clutched tight, glaring at Emily Torres like she'd been personally insulted. "He's the one you should check," she snapped again, pointing at James Carter, her voice a jagged edge. Passengers shifted, some craning necks, others sinking lower, her words planting seeds of doubt in the tired air. Emily's face hardened. "Ma'am, sit down, or you're off when we land," she said, her tone cold now, no more patience left. Lydia's eyes darted around, catching the wall of fed-up stares. Mike Sullivan's scowl, Claire Evans's frown, and finally, huffed, flopping back into her seat with a loud grunt. "Unbelievable," she muttered, just sharp enough for nearby rows to hear. "They'll let anyone on planes these days." James felt the sting, his fingers curling tighter around his armrests, but he kept his gaze steady, locked on the window. The fury inside simmered. Her hate was old news, but it still burned. He wouldn't give her the fight she craved, not now. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, tires kissing the runway, and a collective exhale rippled through. Passengers unbuckled slow, reaching for bags, eager to bolt, but James stayed put, sensing this wasn't over. Lydia's jab hung there, stirring whispers among a few who glanced his way, unsure what to think. Emily stood by the galley, radio in hand, her eyes flicking between Lydia and James, ready for whatever came next. Sarah Miller joined her, whispering something quick. James took a slow breath. Steeling himself, landing didn't end this mess. Lydia wasn't the type to let go, and he knew she'd try one last swing. The plane rolled to a stop at the Seattle gate, engines winding down, and the seatbelt sign flicked off with a faint ding. Passengers stretched and grabbed bags, but Lydia Harper was up in a flash, shoving past her row to the aisle. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice a piercing wail as she pointed at James Carter. "He's dangerous. I won't feel safe until you do something." Heads turned fast, a mix of groans and gasps filling the cabin. James stayed seated, his face a mask of calm, though his pulse ticked up. She was relentless. Sarah Miller hurried forward, blocking Lydia's path to the front. "Ma'am, we'll deal with this off the plane," she said, firm but frazzled, her hands raised to hold the line. Lydia's eyes blazed. "Off the plane? He shouldn't even be here," she screeched, loud enough to echo off the overhead bins. "Captain, get out here! I demand you handle this!" Passengers froze, bags half pulled from bins, some whispering now. Her noise was stirring the pot again. James felt the weight of their stares, a few uncertain, others just annoyed. Captain Daniel Brooks stepped out of the cockpit, his cap squared, his expression tight with irritation. "What's going on now?" he asked, voice low but carrying authority. Lydia pounced, jabbing a finger toward James. "That man's a threat!" she cried. "I've been saying it the whole flight. He's hiding something, and you're all ignoring me." Brooks glanced at James, then back at her, his jaw tightening. "We've landed," he said, clipped. "Let's keep this civil." But Lydia wasn't having it. She wanted blood, and James was still in her sights. The air buzzed thick with her fury, and he knew the real showdown was just starting. Captain Daniel Brooks stood firm at the front, his arms crossed as Lydia Harper's voice barreled through the cabin. "What's the problem?" he asked, his tone clipped, eyes narrowing at her. Lydia didn't hesitate. She thrust a finger toward James Carter, still seated near the back. "Him," she barked, her face twisted with triumph. "He's a danger to everyone on this plane. I've been warning you for hours. Check him, do your job." Her words rang out, loud and certain, and a hush fell over the passengers. Some leaned forward, curious. Others sank back, tired of her noise, but hooked now. James felt the heat of their stares, his hands steady on his lap, though his mind raced. She was pushing this to the edge. Sarah Miller stepped closer to Brooks, her voice low. "She's been at this since takeoff." Brooks nodded once, sharp, then turned to Lydia. "We're on the ground," he said, calm but stern. "If there's an issue, security can handle it." Lydia's lips curled into a smug grin like she'd won already. "Good, call him," she demanded, crossing her arms tight, her gold bracelets glinting. "I want him gone." Emily Torres grabbed her radio, murmuring into it quick, her eyes flicking to James with a mix of worry and apology. Passengers whispered now. A guy in a hoodie muttered, "She's nuts," but a woman nearby clutched her bag. James didn't move, his face blank, though he felt the pressure building. He'd been here before. Judged, questioned. But this was her last play, and he knew it. Lydia stood tall, basking in her moment, certain she'd get her way. The jet bridge clicked into place outside, and footsteps echoed security was coming, and she thought she'd called checkmate. The cabin door swung open, and 2 security officers stepped aboard, their boots thudding against the floor. The taller one, a broad guy with a buzz cut, scanned the rows, his radio crackling softly. Lydia Harper's face lit up, her smug grin widening as she pointed at James Carter like a hunter marking prey. "That's him," she declared, her voice ringing with victory. "He's the one I've been telling you about. Get him off this plane." Passengers turned, a mix of murmurs and held breaths rippling through, some annoyed, others caught up in the drama. James stayed calm, his hands resting loose in his lap, though his gut tightened. He'd seen this coming, Lydia's last swing, and he was ready. The second officer, shorter with the clipped beard, nodded at her and moved down the aisle. "Sir," he said, stopping by James's seat, "we need you to come with us." His tone was neutral, professional but firm, no room for debate. James gave a slow nod, grabbing his bag from under the seat with steady hands. "Sure," he said, voice even, standing up smooth and unhurried. Lydia practically bounced, her gold bracelets jangling as she clapped her hands once. "See? I knew it!" she crowed, turning to Captain Brooks and Sarah Miller. "I told you he was trouble! Finally someone's listening!" Brooks stood silent, his jaw tight, while Sarah and Emily Torres swapped uneasy looks by the galley. Passengers watched James walk down the aisle, some whispering, "What did he do?" Others just glad the yelling might stop. Lydia's eyes gleamed, her chest puffed out like she'd won a war. James kept his head high, steps measured, knowing the real twist was seconds away, and she had no idea what was coming. James Carter stepped off the plane into the jet bridge, the 2 security officers flanking him, one tall with a buzz cut, the other shorter with a beard. The taller one glanced at him, his face all business. "Sir, can you tell us what happened back there?" he asked, voice low as they moved away from the open door. James nodded once, calm as ever, and reached into his hoodie pocket. "Sure," he said, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a gold FBI badge that caught the light. Special Agent James Carter, etched clear as day. The officers froze, their eyes widening like they'd been hit with a stun gun. "FBI?" the shorter one stammered, his clipboard dipping slightly. James gave a faint shrug. "On my way to a briefing in Seattle?" "That woman's been at me since takeoff." Back in the cabin, Lydia Harper stood by her seat, still crowing to Captain Brooks and Sarah Miller. "I was right all along," her voice carried out smug and loud, until it didn't. She caught sight of James flashing the badge, and her grin vanished, her face draining to a sickly white. "What?" she croaked, stepping into the aisle, her gold bracelet silent now. "FBI?" the word choked out, barely a whisper as her victory crumbled. Passengers craned their necks, whispers exploding. Claire Evans gasped, Mike Sullivan smirked, and the guy in the hoodie muttered, "No way." James didn't look back, just tucked the badge away and met the officer's stunned stares. "Call my supervisor if you need to," he said, cool and steady. Lydia's knees wobbled. She'd swung hard and missed, and the truth was slamming her down fast. The jet bridge felt like a spotlight as the taller security officer scratched his buzz cut, still reeling. "Agent Carter, we're so sorry about this," he said, his voice thick with regret. James shrugged, casual but firm. "You're just doing your job. No harm done." His eyes slid past them to Lydia Harper, who'd stumbled out of the plane, her face a mix of shock and panic. I didn't know," she sputtered, her hands flailing, gold bracelets clinking like alarm bells. James turned to her, his calm cutting deeper than any shout. "You didn't know because you didn't ask," he said, voice steady and cold. "You saw me and decided, based on what? My skin?" The words landed like a slap, and Lydia flinched, her mouth opening and closing with no sound. Passengers trickled out behind her, their stares hard now. Claire Evans shook her head, Mike Sullivan crossed his arms, and the woman with the scarf whispered, "Unbelievable." Lydia's smug armor was gone, replaced by a crumbling mess. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, stepping back as the officers glanced her way, unsure now who the real problem was. James didn't let up. "You meant every word, you just didn't expect to be wrong," he said, his gaze unflinching. The shorter officer shifted, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, we'll need to talk to you too," he said, nodding at Lydia. Her eyes widened, darting around for an escape, but the crowd wasn't hers anymore. Whispers turned to mutters. "She's the one who caused this. What a disgrace!" And her shoulders slumped. James stood tall, the weight of her hate sliding off him. He'd faced it before, beaten it before, and this was no different. Lydia Harper's voice cracked as she tried to claw back control. "I didn't mean it like that," she pleaded, her hands wringing together, gold bracelets clinking weakly now. James Carter stood firm in the jet bridge, his eyes locked on her for one last beat. "You meant it," he said, voice low and final. "You could have stopped any time, but you didn't." The taller security officer stepped toward her, his buzz cut catching the light. "Ma'am, let's step aside, we need a word," he said, his tone flat but firm. The shorter one nodded, clipboard ready, as they guided her away from the gate. Lydia's head jerked around, searching for a friendly face, but the passengers filing out offered nothing. Mike Sullivan brushed past with a cold stare. Claire Evans muttered, "Good riddance," and the guy in the hoodie shook his head. Her shoulders sank, the weight of her own words crushing her now. James turned away, adjusting his bag strap, his step steady as he moved toward the terminal. He didn't need to watch her fall, he'd seen enough. The sting of her hate lingered, a familiar ache from years of proving himself, but he'd walked through worse and come out stronger. Seattle stretched ahead, a briefing waiting, a case to crack, real work, not this petty noise. The officers' voices faded behind him, Lydia's protests shrinking to a pitiful whine. "You can't do this. I'm the victim." No one bought it anymore. James kept going, his hoodie blending into the airport crowd, his calm unshaken. He'd stood his ground, turned her game upside down, and that was enough. She'd made her bed, now she'd lie in it, alone, with the mess she'd built. James Carter melted into the Seattle-Tacoma airport crowd, his hoodie a gray blur among the travelers rushing through the terminal. The jet bridge faded behind him, along with Lydia Harper's last gasps of protest. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. His focus shifted sharp to the briefing ahead, a drug ring case he'd been tracking for weeks. This flight, her noise, was just a blip, another story of ignorance he'd outlasted. His earbuds stayed tucked away, the jazz replaced by the hum of purpose as he strode toward the exit, badge secure in his pocket. Back at the gate, Lydia sat alone on a hard plastic chair. her designer purse limp in her lap. The security officers loomed nearby, scribbling notes, her voice a faint whimper now. "I just wanted to feel safe." No one listened. Passengers streamed past. Mike Sullivan hauling his duffel, Claire Evans typing furiously on her phone, the kid in the Seahawks cap tugging Jessica Parker's hand, all casting cold glances her way. Her gold bracelets looked dull under the fluorescent lights, her smugness stripped bare. She'd swung hard, missed harder, and the truth had knocked her flat. Whispers lingered. "Serves her right." What a clown, as the crowd thinned, leaving her with nothing but her own echo. James hit the escalator, the city sprawling beyond the glass, a new fight waiting. He'd faced her kind before, loud, blind, certain they were right, and he'd beaten them every time, not with shouts but with who he was. The flight was over, the point made. Lydia's humiliation was her own doing, a lesson she'd carry alone. For James it was another win, quiet and steady, a step forward in a world still learning what he'd always known. This story remains unverified, a tale woven from imagination rather than fact. The characters, James Carter, Lydia Harper, and others, along with the Chicago to Seattle flight setting, have been altered and crafted to serve as illustrations, not reflections of real events. Names, places, and details are fictional, designed to spotlight a broader truth. Its purpose isn't to document history, but to offer a lesson. Prejudice can blind us, entitlement can backfire, and resilience can triumph. Through this narrative, we're reminded to look beyond assumptions, value dignity over division, and recognize the strength in standing firm, a message meant for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more exciting stories every day. See you in the next one.